So much of life is all about working with Rahu and Ketu. Getting Ketu and Rahu to work in such a way that we can have a happy, secure life that also presents the newness, the ever-new things, the expansion of consciousness, the new experiences that make it worthwhile to continue to stay alive. And this is really what we're doing with Rahu and Ketu. So in astrology, all the planets represent a part of the working kingdom. The sun is the king, the moon's the queen, Mars is the commander. Venus and Jupiter are the priests, the Brahmins. Mercury is the heir to the throne, the crown prince or the crown princess, whatever you want to call her. And Rahu and Ketu are the armies. It's a really neat part of Rahu and Ketu. They're stated to be the armies of the kingdom. Ketu is the army that holds the protection of the kingdom. The army which keeps the country safe, such as the police, the FBI, institutions like that. Rahu is the army that advances into foreign countries, goes to strange places, so the Marines, the Navy SEALs, spies, the CIA, all those people. Okay? Coast Guard would be Ketu. The Army Reserves that stay at home to protect the country would be Ketu. So we have these two different parts of the army, two important functions, to protect what's established and to move and to conquer what needs to be conquered. Okay? The army of Ketu is stationed on very familiar ground, but it holds the ground too rigidly for the people to flourish, which is to say for happiness to grow. If a state is overly policed, what happens? It decays. So this is what happens. Communism, you talk to people who grew up in communist countries and you realize how the people were just so overly policed that these countries decayed and they couldn't flourish. And as a result, communism has proved to not succeed in the model it's been practiced in. This is what happens with Ketu. It over-polices, it curbs freedoms, it destroys choice, and destroys life. In such a society, what is it that the policemen need in order to allow life to flourish once more? They have to have compassion, the ability to feel and to care, and so to allow the rigid rules to be bent and even broken for the sake of happiness and growth. When something's overly policed, when something has to be done by the book all the time, when there's only certain things that are right and everything else is frowned upon, you get this mass stagnation that will extinct a race, will destroy a culture, will destroy a country. Okay? If the cost of theft is to have your hand cut off or to be put to death, and you're starving so you steal some food and you're put to death, it's not gonna, that's Ketu. That's how Ketu operates. He's too rigid. He only allows for certain things. He doesn't allow for the bigger picture. Or he doesn't allow for the circumstances, the varying circumstances. So the compassion, the ability to feel and care, and so to allow the rigid rules to be bent and even broken for the sake of happiness and growth. So Ketu has the security paradigm, to be okay, to survive. These rules, laws, whatever you want to call them, of Ketu policing our lives were established so we can survive. That was the purpose of them. But to think that we could continue to live by those same rules and continue to survive is a false idea. Every country that adopted communism did so at a point in time where in doing so, it gave it a chance to survive. Unless it was one of those countries that was overtaken, of course, and forced into communism. But any country that chose communism or chose a certain political government, they did it because at the time that's what it needed to survive. But that was at that time. What does it need now? And that's what we always need to be asking ourselves with Ketu. Is this really what I need now to survive? Or do I have to bend the rules a little bit? The key, therefore, to working with Ketu's position is compassion for oneself, out of which comes acceptance for oneself. So I say with working with Rahu and Ketu, we have the two C's. Compassion for Ketu, courage for Rahu. Without compassion for oneself, there is no hope to grow in happiness. The police will enforce the state will enforce the state rigidly, and life will continue to decay. So we don't have compassion for ourselves, to break some of the rules, to be slack in our security paradigm, to do the things that seem like they're ridiculous to do, that go against our security paradigm. We have to allow ourselves to do that. And also, very importantly, an interesting thing about the security paradigm of Ketu, by trying to live it and follow it, we actually create huge problems in our life. Some of our gravest errors in life will be the result of trying to play out our security paradigm. At that point, what do? Not only has our security paradigm not given us the happiness we thought, it's actually caused us to blunder terribly, to possibly create the worst, usually create some of the worst mistakes in our life. And then we have to live with that somehow. So we have to have compassion for ourselves, realizing that we lived under a certain set of rules that we thought would work. We made some mistakes living that way, and it's okay. It's acceptable. We have to allow for it. Ketu, because it's always striving for perfection, has such a hard time giving itself the allowances, allowing us to make mistakes. Ketu just does not want to make mistakes or screw up. He has to find compassion. And so not being able to find compassion, he gets stuck. We will be stuck in Ketu until we have compassion for our circumstance. That circumstance will be the result of our fate, but it'll also be the result of our actions to do the best thing that backfired on us. Our ignorant actions, where we just didn't know better. At that point, we screwed up. How are we going to deal with that? We have to have compassion for ourselves as a mere mortal. But Ketu has such a hard time giving itself that compassion because he's looking for perfection. There is no room for error. There's no margin of anything but 100% with Ketu. And so it's really hard for a person to be compassionate with their failings because of Ketu. But they have to be, otherwise they can't grow. You know, Ketu, because it has this Saturn connotation over here, Ketu very much gets tied into the ego. The ego needs to be perfect. The ego needs to be perfect, and it can't admit its failings. To have compassion for ourselves, we have to truly acknowledge our own failings. That it's truly our fault. As soon as we can truly acknowledge that it's our own failings, we'll find compassion for ourselves. But what happens with Ketu, it's often so hard for people to have compassion for themselves because their ego has too much of a need to be perfect. And so they resist being compassionate to themselves. And they can stick to their Ketu paradigm even more strongly as a result and push themselves into a deeper and more unhealthy state. So it's a really ironic thing that happens. We only can be compassionate when we acknowledge our failings. Until then, we can't be. Since Ketu, the Saturn part of Ketu, the ego part doesn't want to acknowledge its failings. Deep down inside, it won't give itself compassion because it won't acknowledge its own failings, and somehow deep down inside, it's blaming things on the outside, on other people, on other circumstances, and not owning up to its own mistakes. Until the person gets the humility to say, yeah, I screwed up, they can't have compassion for screwing up, right? So it's a really tricky thing I see Ketu do in a lot of people, where it just cannot be compassionate. And I know when someone can't be accepting of their blunder, it's because deep down inside, they're blaming somebody else. They're blaming something else. Usually somebody else. Because Rahu and Ketu always are working with the outside, the other people, the seventh. They're opposite each other. So keep that in mind when you see people struggling with being accepting of their failures, the bungles they've made, the problems they've caused. It's because their ego still deep down inside thinks it's not at fault, that it's perfect and somebody else is responsible. And that puts them into a very negative state where there's a bitterness and the tendency to keep trying to live according to that security paradigm and not growing and not becoming more healthy. So without compassion, the police will enforce the state rigidly and life will continue to decay. Ketu will enforce your life too securely, focus on the security paradigm, and you'll keep going downhill. The army of Rahu has to venture into strange places where they have no idea what may befall them, what dangers await, or what resources they will have available to them to help ensure their survival. It takes great courage to do this, as well as innovation. They have to have the courage to do something new and different, which is Rahu. So this army is getting involved in new things, doesn't know what to expect. Takes a lot of courage to jump off the edge of what you know. That's what Rahu requires. Without courage, we cannot take the plunge towards Rahu. It's a deathly, fearful feeling to jump into Rahu. People would rather die than, death seems less fearful to many people than to commit and embrace and jump and run into Rahu. It takes great courage to do this, as well as innovation. Okay. Without courage to do something different, there is no hope to venture towards Rahu and get the needed perspective to create happiness. Okay? Rahu requires so much courage. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is considered the definition of insanity. That's what insanity is defined as, psychologically speaking. That is what the security paradigm of Ketu causes a person to do. Ketu, that security paradigm, makes us try something and try it the same way again and try it the same way again, and every time it doesn't work and we try it the same way again. Having courage and venturing towards Rahu is to do something different for you. That's Rahu. Which means to take a step away from insanity. Something's not working, so you try anything different. Even something different that works worse is a step towards sanity compared to doing the same thing over and again and expecting a different result. Doing something different and getting a worse result is a healthier state of mind than doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay? So Rahu, having the courage to do something different, to move towards Rahu, is taking a step away from insanity. Ironically, many of the behaviors of Rahu are seen as crazy behaviors from a societal point of view, or from a point of view of your family, your partner, the people you felt comfortable with, because those people are going to somehow fit into your Ketu security paradigm. But if it's a different attempt for the individual, it is actually a step towards sanity. Okay? So when you judge if a person's behavior makes sense or doesn't make sense, find out, is this a behavior that they're just trying to see what happens? Or have they done this behavior before and it never worked and yet they're trying it again? If that's the case, they're insane. But no matter what the behavior is, if it's a new attempt to achieve happiness, it's a better attempt. It's more of a sane attempt. If you know nothing, if you're the biggest fool on earth, but you want something and you only try once, and if it doesn't get it, you try something different, and then you try something different, and you try something different, one day, just by chance, you'll do it the right way. But no matter how smart of a genius you are, if you do the same thing and it doesn't work, and you do the same thing and it doesn't work, and you do the same thing again and it doesn't work, you will never, by any stroke of chance, succeed. So, doing the stupidest thing that's different is a better choice than doing what appears as the most sensible thing over and over again that is proven to be ineffective. If the individual does not have the courage to take this step, the courageous step, the result will be that the individual will suffer complete decay by the security paradigm of Ketu. They will get stuck in the security paradigm that will dominate their life, and their life will be basically finished, and they'll become a psychological antique that's simply not capable of any growth anymore. The people you know who are so stuck in themselves, living a certain way that there's no room for anything else, these are the people I'm talking about. It's normal for the individual, as they seek to grow into greater balance, to go to extremes of Rahu, to go out of balance in the very opposite direction of Ketu. That happens lots of times. We teeter-totter. Too much Ketu, too much Rahu, then that's screwing, that didn't work, then too much Ketu. It takes great self-examination and work to find a healthy balance between Rahu and Ketu, which is the only solution. Painfully teeter-tottering between Rahu and Ketu is quite normal, with each teetering event hopefully bringing a bit less imbalanced, being a bit less imbalanced than the previous. So Rahu and Ketu, we tend to blunder back and forth. A big Ketu blunder, a big Rahu blunder, a big Ketu blunder, a big Rahu blunder. But as we go, the Ketu blunder should be less and the Rahu blunder should be less, until finally we have a nice, harmonious, livable life at our back. So that's how it works. It's all about this balance. And this balance, of course, is going to be defined by Ketu on one side, Rahu on the other side. The sign that Ketu's in, the house that Ketu's in, the nakshatra Ketu's in, planets with Ketu. All trying to balance against the Rahu planets, the sign Rahu's in, the nakshatra Rahu's in, the house Rahu's in, and so on. So, Ketu and Rahu will give the effects as per their placement in the chart. The Rashi, the nakshatra, the bhavakas they join, and any planets that are joined. So there's always going to be a Rashi effect and a bhava effect. So we really need to understand what's the difference between Ketu in a sign and Ketu in a house. Ketu's in Gemini and the third house. There's a similarity between Gemini and the third, but what's really different? Okay, we have to understand that. And then there'll always be a nakshatra effect, of course, and but there's not always going to be a bhava-cusp effect. Okay. So first, we have to understand that the goal of Rahu and Ketu is the development of greater consciousness. They are the path that our consciousness travels. They're a line through the chart that our consciousness is traveling towards ultimately liberation. The Rashi effect shows the developmental needs of Rahu and Ketu, which must be experienced in concrete ways, while the bhava effects indicate the areas of life through which these developmental needs will occur. So the Rashi effect is the most important effect. It's what the home run the person needs to hit. But the area of life that they're going to hit that home run is the house. So for instance, I guess a better way of saying it, the sign represents the concrete area of life that they have, the concrete experience that they need to have victory over. They need to have victory in those signs. But the game they're playing to have the victory is going to be indicated by the house position. Okay? So, a person has, let's say, I'm taking it to sports. He has to achieve a victory in a sport in order to grow and evolve. But is the sport tennis? Is it basketball? Is it football? What is the sport? It could be any sport. What sport they succeed in isn't as important as the fact that there's a need to succeed in a sport. So with the sign position, that's the need to succeed in something. What game they're playing to learn that success and achieve that success hardly matters. Okay? So say a person has a need to become great at something. Are they a great athlete, a great businessman, a great leader, a great astrologer? Those aren't as important what they become great at as the fact that they need to shine as a person. Okay? So it's similar with the signs. So the signs are of a more important thing, but the immediate urgency is on the house, on the bhavas, because that's the game being played. You know, the purpose of that whole game is for the sign, though. And generally speaking, we're more aware of the game than the purpose of the game. So as when we're young, we really realize the importance of, oh, I need to achieve this house. I have to balance and achieve this Rahu house. This Rahu house gives me trouble. And we don't see that the whole reason of that is because of the sign. So the sign is the more important, the core, the foundation. But we get involved in the details really easily, which is the sign. And as we start to master the house, we start realizing, actually, the game, the house, I don't even care. It doesn't even matter the house. It's that sign. It's that sign I've always been trying to perfect. The house, I don't care. The sign is a limb of Vishnu, right? It's a part of God. The house is more removed from that. It's just where God is playing. So the feet are Pisces. So that's the feet of Vishnu. Vishnu's walking around. And it's his feet. Vishnu's feet that are important. It's not important what Vishnu steps. So Vishnu is stepping here, first house, and he steps to the second house, and he steps to the third house as Pisces moves through the houses. Hardly matters where Vishnu is stepping. What matters is Vishnu's feet and what his feet are capable of doing. So the signs are more important than are the houses. Okay? That's why Jaimini Sutras, I think, is so sign-centered. It's very much a sign-centered system where a sign gains importance because of how it's stamped by a planet. Like a sign becomes your Swamsha sign because of where the Atmakaraka is and so on. And a sign becomes the Pada sign. We find and isolate these critical signs in the chart with Jaimini. But in Rahu and Ketu, it's the sign we're after. Once a person realizes it's the sign they're after, not the house becomes irrelevant. The house is like, oh, no big deal. But until then, there's a craving to balance the house. The house seems so important, so critical, the most important things in their life. Because that's the game that they're playing. But it's not the game we're playing that's important, it's what we hope to gain from playing the game. And that's the sign. Okay? So it's important to first understand the Rashi effects in Rahu and Ketu. We're going to start there. We're going to start on the reason, the foundation of it all. And then we'll go into the bhavas, the houses, next. There are many factors that bring out the full effects of Rahu and Ketu in a Rashi. It's best to understand each of these factors individually as different parts will be the critical lesson at different times, and these different parts can come together in very unique ways, making every person's Rahu and Ketu's experience very unique. What I mean by that is, we can say, okay, Ketu is in Gemini. Tell me about Ketu in Gemini. Well, Ketu in Gemini is like this. Okay, Ketu in Taurus. Ketu in Taurus is like this. No, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to say, Ketu is in a sign ruled by Mercury. So that means Ketu is in Gemini or Virgo. Because Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, if you have Ketu in Gemini or you have Ketu in Virgo, you're going to have some very same things, exactly the same things going on in your life. And then we're going to say, Ketu's in a dual sign, Ketu's in a fixed sign. And then we're going to say, Ketu's in a male sign, Ketu's in a female sign, Ketu's in a fiery sign, Ketu's in a watery sign. Every quality of the sign becomes an important factor. So, Aries, Ketu in Aries, Ketu in Cancer, Ketu in Libra, Ketu in Capricorn will all have something in common because of the fact that they're all movable signs. Ketu in Pisces, Ketu in Cancer, Ketu in Scorpio will all have a common denominator because they're water signs. So when I do my Rahu Ketu readings for people, I don't say, well, you've got Ketu in this sign, this means this. And I just say, well, Ketu's in a water sign, and I talk about that part. And I say Ketu's in a fixed sign, and I talk about what it means to be in a fixed sign. And I talk about all the different parts of the sign that I talked about in the last Rashi Sutras course. And we give the interpretations for all of that. And then you use the one that you need to. You rarely need to talk to about the person about the entire sign, everything about the sign. Lots of times, all I need to talk to the person is for 5 minutes, I talk to, well, your problem is, what you're struggling with, is that Ketu's in an earth sign. You know? And I find, actually, I probably find the most, one I most need to talk to people about is simply the element that Ketu and Rahu are in. That's usually the most important part of the sign. But not always. Sometimes it's some other part of the sign. But in general, the element seems to be where I spend most of my time talking with the person. So I don't need to talk all about Gemini and every part of Gemini, and Gemini is two people and da-da-da-da-da. Lots of times all I need to say, well, you got Ketu in an air sign and this is why your life is screwing up right now. And that's all they need to know. So as we go through the interpretations, which we're going to get into the next video, I'll be doing one part of a sign at a time. It's the ruler of the sign, the modality of the sign, and so on. Same with the houses. I won't say Ketu in the first house, I'll say Ketu in a Dharma house. Ketu in this kind of house, and so on, okay? We'll break it down to those same things. So you really understand every little part that Rahu and Ketu are doing. Then when you talk to a person, you can talk about as many parts as necessary for them to get their situation. Then Ketu with planets. When Ketu is with the planet, it's very important, or Rahu's with the planet. We need to look at the planets that are most influenced by Rahu and Ketu. That's not always going to be there won't always be a planet with Rahu and Ketu. But there'll always be a planet that's most influenced by Rahu and Ketu. We're always going to seek those planets out and give those a lot of emphasis. Okay? Then there's going to be planets that are most capable of helping you balance Rahu and Ketu. Those are really, really important to look at too. And all that stuff will show your concrete experiences, what you concretely need to experience and embrace in a way to evolve. Now, as you're making this journey, as your soul is making this journey through this concrete reality of life, of the world, indicated by the signs and by the place that the signs are playing, which are the houses, we also are responding and reacting in a way to try to maintain our balance, to try to hold it together, to try to be at peace. We're adapting and evolving through all that, right? These concrete experiences are adapting us and evolving us in a way. How we're adapting, how we respond to these concrete things to grow and mature, that's indicated by the nakshatras. So after we understand all the concrete things that are impacting us, we'll go to the next step, and also not just the concrete things that are impacting us, but the healthy and unhealthy results of that. Then we'll talk about the nakshatras, which talk about how we are responding and reacting to that concrete reality. Okay, so you can have two people with Ketu and Taurus being handled out, having a very similar concrete security paradigm, but responding to that security paradigm in completely different ways. Because not only the nakshatra that their Ketu's in, but the pada it's in, and not only the pada it's in, but even the 1/9 part that it's in. Okay? So we get a lot more details about the person and how they're behaving and trying to make life work based on that nakshatra. But it's the next level. We really want to start with the rashis and focus on those, because that's the urgency, that's the need, that's the reality. The nakshatra is their response to that reality. How do they respond to that? How do they try to deal with it? And that doesn't help us very much if we don't understand what the situation is. Okay, so we're going to learn what the situation is in the first part of this course. Okay, so next video we will start with interpretations of Rahu and Ketu and all the different possible signs and houses and so on. Thank you.